Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Hey everybody, welcome back to another Scriptural Works podcast episode. I'm here with my co-host Greg Camp. Greg, good to see you as always.
And trying to survive the heat of Fresno in the summer.
Yeah, we may be hitting 90 here in the Pacific Northwest, so we're
that's
hot.
A little too warm.
and Stan across the northern border, he maybe hit 80.
We're having 72 degrees today, so it's warm temperature summer.
Yeah, for you, for sure. So I have known Stan for, just to give our audience a little context, for 35 years or somewhere in that vicinity. We were students together back at Abilene Christian University and studied under Dr. Carol Osborne, who was a wonderful, still is a wonderful person and teacher and mentor, among other things. And I actually learned a few things from him, although our audience might not know it from some of my questions on occasion. Stan is going to help us not wrap up, but it's a continuation of our series on the ending of the Gospels as well as Acts. And Stan has done a lot of writing over the years on the ending of Mark, so that's what we're honing in on for today's conversation. The ending of Mark, as our audience might know, has a couple different options. One, as the bulk of the early manuscript tradition attests, it ends with 16:8, with the women fleeing, and that's it. And you wonder what else happened. And there's a lot of theories. It could have been lost. Could be that Mark wanted to end it that way. And then some others got involved because they felt like the story needed to be completed. And there's a shorter ending, and then there's a longer ending. And those of us who have in brackets in our Bibles, the longer ending, shorter ending is attested by just a couple manuscripts and church fathers, but the longer ending is attested widely. And Stan's going to talk a bit about that during today's podcast. Is quite interesting, and most of us are familiar with the snake handling and so forth, which is included in it. But before we do so, let's introduce Stan. Stan, I will try to roll through this and not spend too much time. Has a very extensive background, BA in Biblical Studies, Oklahoma Christian University, MS and Master Divinity in Historical Theology and Greek New Testament and Ministry at Abilene Christian University. That's when I had the fortune of meeting him. A Doctorate of Ministry and Leadership from Abilene Christian University, theology, a master's in theology, as well as a PhD in New Testament from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Stan obviously never got tired of going to school. His wife may have somewhere along the way. He is the president and professor of New Testament ministry at Alberta Bible College, governing authority for the Church of Christ, the Christian Church in Alberta, responsible for clergy registration, weddings, commissioner and evaluator for the Association of Biblical Higher Education's Commission on Accreditation, as well as the New Testament chair for the Pacific Northwest SBL. Back in the 90s, as I alluded to, Stan published a key review on Churches of Christ in Mark 16, 9 through 20, which analyzed the authenticity and textual evidence of what we will describe as the longer ending of Mark, and argued that it is a secondary edition, but he had a number of interesting arguments there. And then he most recently published another article and read a couple of papers on it as well in regards to Origen and the ending of the Gospel of Mark, which included, I think, a section of his dissertation, which he'll talk about. But before we get started with our in-depth conversation with Stan, let's do a short ad from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So I'll let Greg kick off our conversation with Stan. Thanks for letting me get all that out of the way, but everyone needs to know his fabulous background, all the work that he's done, as well as, I wanted to set the stage for the conversation in regards to all the various endings that exist in regards to the Gospel of Mark.
So, Stan, as Patrick has said, scholars have wrestled with where the appropriate ending for Mark should be, since we have multiple endings. And most have concluded that 16:8 is probably the most original, earliest. But those arguments are sometimes based on silence, that some of the manuscripts have the short or the abrupt ending, and some have a longer ending. But we're still left with, what do we do with this? And there are two manuscript, I won't say traditions, but two major manuscripts, codices, the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which don't have the longer ending, and they're treated as separate traditions, and they end at 16:8. But there's been some work by Claire Clavaz on those physical documents, and her claim is that they don't actually represent separate traditions. Can you say a little bit about what's happening there and how that might disrupt the assumption that these are giving separate evidence to a short ending?
Well, I think it certainly disrupts the notion that we've got two independent witnesses, but I'm not really sure. Many of us have been thinking of them as two independent witnesses because they are both, back when we were more often to use text types, as we called them, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are considered to be closely akin to each other in terms of text. So their exemplars eventually went back to the same, I would think. So they both end Mark at 16:8, but they leave a space where you're wondering if the scribe is thinking something's missing here. Normally in the manuscripts, we just move to the next book in order, right immediately after the end of the text. And so here we're left with blanks, but in the case of at least one, the blank's not big enough for the same size of text to have the longer ending. And Greg, we should point out that since we've got a shorter ending floating around there, we've got more evidence that we've got disruption, because you don't have a shorter ending if you have the longer ending. So that gives evidence that we do have some did have some manuscripts, along with the fact that we do have Eusebius telling us that most of the accurate manuscripts in his day ended at 16:8. So what we have today is a reverse of what Eusebius claims that he experienced.
A reverse in what sense?
That the longer ending was just naturally assumed to be the proper conclusion to the Gospel of Mark.
Okay. Now, in Claire's work, as she's worked through the physical manuscripts, what has she found about the hand that was writing these? This represents a different kind of work than most of us are used to with text criticism.
That's right. And it's not the work that I've done particularly. So my understanding of Claire's work, that there may even be the possibility we're dealing with the same scribe. Now, I haven't looked that closely at the text, but I do know that we've had at least some of us have had a working assumption that these manuscripts possibly represent manuscripts commissioned by Constantine out of Eusebius's library, which of course is Origen's library in Caesarea Maritima. And so if that's the case, then that makes perfect sense that these manuscripts no doubt come from the same exemplars to some degree. But they're not as tightly akin in such a way that you would think that these manuscripts would be almost 95% alike each other. The percentages are not quite that strong, but they're still pretty strong.
Are there any papyri evidence
for the endings of Mark, or
for the
Mark?
endings, for the various endings?
No, there's not. In fact, we should point out, I think the readers would be, or the listeners would be interested in this. We have P45 and we have P137, and they give us 10% of the Gospel of Mark. So before the 4th century, we only have 10% manuscript evidence for the Gospel of Mark, and neither of them give us enough information to know how the manuscript should have ended.
Yeah.
So they took an abbreviated version and made it even more abbreviated. Just 10.
Oh, maybe.
Well, you know what, Stan, that's an interesting point, because those who have dabbled in textual criticism, some in our audience, some haven't, they'll know that the papyri, fill in those gaps before the codices. That you have some of
That's
those
right.
papyri that are earlier, and many of them corroborate the readings in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Not always, but normally. But in this case, Mark there's not as many early manuscripts of Mark, as we have with other texts in the New Testament. You want to speak to that a bit?
Well, I think if you're like me and you believe that Mark was first, then Matthew is actually your evidence for the text of Mark. That somehow there's access to the text of Mark, at least at the very earliest stages. So I think what's interesting here is that the fact that we only have 10% of the Gospel of Mark in manuscript form before we get to basically Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, the church fathers actually become a little bit more important, because they're basically the only way to access the text before the 4th century. Now, I should remind you that when we're talking about manuscripts, even though we're talking about 4th century manuscripts, we always talk in terms of 2 dates. While we've got 4th century manuscripts, we may have a 2nd century text, because the text came from an exemplar.
The test, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, some in our audience probably aren't familiar with Eusebius. Greg mentioned him, or you did, or both of you did.
Yeah.
For the uneducated, or like me, let's talk about who Eusebius was.
Well, we've mentioned Origen several times, and we've not introduced him properly either. So
we're about to. That's
good. But you kind of need Origen for my setup. But Origen lives from 185 to 255, and he is followed he starts a library and a school in Caesarea on the coast of Palestine. And Pamphilus is his more immediate successor. And then his successor in the library is Eusebius. And Eusebius is primarily important to most of us because he wrote the first church history after the book of Acts to some degree. And he starts with the book of Acts in telling his story. Actually, he does a little bit before Acts, but basically he picks up Acts' story, and then he tries to fill in the gap up to his day, up to Constantine. And he sees Constantine's conversion as a major victory for the church.
Yeah.
And so, but an incredible scholar. All of these men that have been mentioned are just incredible scholars. And I would assume that Eusebius has picked up some of the textual skills that Origen has in the 3rd century.
Well, that you teed it up, Stan. So who was Origen? And how did you get interested in studying more about Origen?
Well, as you mentioned, Carol Osborne, I always say that Carol had a knack for taking his master's students and coaxing them into trying to do a PhD level project. And I was Carol Osborne's graduate assistant, and one of the first jobs he gave me was collecting citations of the book of actually, I think we were doing all of the New Testament, but particularly the book of Acts in the early church fathers. And eventually I got into collecting the citations in Origen's work. And originally we thought the assignment should be looking at the text of Acts and the writings of Origen and Eusebius. But I found in time that Origen was plenty of material to work with at one time. And so that was my introduction into working with him. Origen lived, as I said, from 185 to 255. He was born in Alexandria to Christian parents, but he was trained as a classical scholar, a philologist, we would call it today. He has challenges working in Egypt under Demetrius, his bishop, who seems to be motivated out of jealousy. Short story is in the year 230, he moves to Caesarea, and he spends the rest of his life in Caesarea Maritima, teaching, preaching, managing his manuscripts, and also traveling around not only the Holy Land, but also in several other places. He becomes quite useful as a debater, and his own benefactor was someone, Ambrose. Ambrose was somebody that he had talked out of heresy, and so even there's a conversion story involved there. So, that's kind of the short story on Origen. He is persecuted in the Decian persecution of around the year 250, but lives until at least 254 and 255. But he eventually dies, we believe, from the injuries and difficulties that he experienced in the persecution.
So how much work did he have? What was he collecting? What's he known for in terms of text? The hexaplas, when
he was certainly interested in collecting not only the Hebrew text, but also several versions of the Greek Septuagint version. And he basically wanted to support the Septuagint since he had a vibrant, not only was Caesarea a vibrant community of Christians, but the Jewish community there was very vibrant. There are several places in Origen's interpretation that we're pretty certain he's in dialogue with the Jewish community that is part of that community, part of Caesarea. So
is he collecting manuscripts, comparing them, and what's happened to his manuscripts?
Well, a good number
or
of
his
them,
writings.
Yeah. Later on, one writer will estimate his writings to be in the range of 6,000 writings. I think that's a little extravagant, but maybe he's not far off. Because Origen is condemned later on because his views are considered heterodox, we believe a lot of his writings were destroyed. And so we have some of his writings in Greek, which is the language he would have been most current in. But fortunately, Jerome and Rufinus and others have translated it. And the translations are not, it's hard to backtrack from Latin to get back to a Greek text. You got to be very careful in using the Latin materials to get back to some kind of Greek original. But fortunately, we do have a good number of writings that have come to us in Greek. Now, one of the most interesting finds is about 10 years ago now, 29 homilies on Psalms were discovered in the Greek. We knew these Psalms from Latin translations, but it was nice to get to Greek so that we could actually see what the Latin translators had done to the text. And overall, the Latin translators were pretty close. They did a decent job, although they did try to morph here and there to make them a little more orthodox, at least for the time that they're translating in.
Interesting.
Yeah. But we still have a huge corpus of Origen's writings. And he wrote commentaries, homilies were transcribed. He's got apologetic works, and he's got theological works. I guess we could call First Principles kind of a book on hermeneutics. Yeah.
Now, Stan, we talked a bit about the longer ending when we began the podcast, but it might be useful to dive into some of the details. When did it first pop up? I think Tations diatessaron, which for our audience, you may want to explain what that is, and then where Origen may have got it. There's an Irenaeus connection and so forth.
There is. The earliest evidence that I'm willing to concede that we absolutely have would be a citation in Irenaeus's Against Heresies, in which he actually says, he's quoting from, I believe, verse 18 or 19, latter part of the short ending, where he actually says, Mark ends this way. And so So he's definitely got a copy of Mark in front of him that ends with the longer ending.
That's
And
around
so
180, somewhere in that vicinity,
yeah,
Stan.
180 is definite. Although if you pushed me on the Diatessaron, which is a four gospel harmony that became very popular in the Syrian church and became the standard Bible or New Testament for, or at least the Gospels early on, certainly seems to have evidence of the longer ending. In some ways, it seems to me that folks that are working out of a more of a Greek orientation tends not to know this. Uh, when the text critics say that Origen doesn't know it, that's what I'm arguing against. Basically, is you can't say what Origen doesn't know. What you can say is that the extant or the extant writings that we have of Origen doesn't seem to show any knowledge of that. And so
Hmm.
I'm asking for a little bit of clarity there. Now, I also end my paper with saying that just because of this, we can't say that Origen actually knew the text, even though I think I built a pretty decent case saying he had to know the longer ending.
Mhm.
And I think it's very likely he knew the shorter ending as well. And we can talk a little bit later about the methodology that's used to extrapolate text types or the text that Origen most represents in his copy of Mark or in his text of Mark. So
Now, Stan, he's not the only one in antiquity to attest all three endings, or likely all three endings, in existence. There's a Codex Regius that
yeah,
has them as well, I believe, and you talk a bit about that in your article.
yeah, I do. Well, let me dive into the text critical piece there. The kind of work that I've done and that grew out of the work that Carol Osborne got me started on is we do statistical analysis based on reconstruction of Origen's text. So I did my dissertation, which has been published on Origen's text of Acts. And so what I do to get there is I go through all of Origen's writings and I collect everything. I collected the Latin, and even though I couldn't build text off of it, because I wanted to create a catalog, verse by verse catalog, so that you could quickly look and see what text was available for that verse. If you wanted, you could always go to the original work and look for larger context. So basically, we create a reconstructed text. Sometimes we put limits on time frames, like a couple of scholars that I'll mention later, um, in which we do Origen's early writings and his later writings. And I've done some of that in my examination of the book of Acts. But I basically create a composite text of Acts that represents Origen's text. Now, the composite text never existed as a single text
Yeah.
because we pulled it from a variety of works. But then you find significant variants, and significant variants are those that are able to give you some indication about the text's genealogical journey. That is, what text is it related to. And so you take your significant variants and you weigh it against the same textual variants within the manuscript tradition, and you basically answer the question: Origen's text of Acts look most like what? So we're
Mm-hmm.
doing the same thing. And I'm not the one who did the original statistical work in the Gospel of Mark. It was a project that I did as I was working on my PhD. Uh, and so, but what we do is we're able to say, for example, in the text of Acts, I can tell you for certain that the Acts that's being used by the text of Acts, being used by Origen, looks like Vaticanus.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
is most akin to Vaticanus, which again is another interesting tie-in to Caesarea and Vaticanus. Now, the hypothesis I started with, because scholars had suggested that since the Paul's writings in Origen look a whole lot like manuscript 1739, that
Mm-hmm.
we'd find the same in the Book of Acts, but we don't.
Hmm.
Yeah. So again, I'm able to extrapolate from that backwards that then Origen's text had to look something like this, and I can use for example 1739 to approximate text Origen never quoted as being something like this. Again, I'm being a bit speculative, but I'm on the right track. So we've done the same thing. Origen's text of Mark looks most like Codex Regius. And what makes this manuscript important is that it ends with a clear ending at 16:8, marked off in the text with kind of conclusion. And then there's a note saying that other manuscripts have, and then it introduces the shorter ending, I think it is, and then another comment saying others in this way, and it has the longer ending. And so what struck me as interesting here is that this is precisely how Origen, as a text critic, would want to mark a text.
Yeah.
So what date would you put Codex Regius? Where is this appearing in time?
10th century, isn't it?
Okay.
I think so.
You guys have read my paper. It's been a while since I've looked at it. 10th or 11th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it attests, your argument would be it attests an earlier version or attestation of the text in Mark.
And Mark's using, or Origen's using something that's in line with that.
I would say that in order for us to get to a Codex Regius, it has to go through some transition, some transmission.
Somewhere along the way.
I would argue that given the similarity of text, there's no doubt in my mind that the precursors, maybe even the exemplar on which Regius is based, comes possibly from Caesarea.
Interesting.
Yeah. And when you group it together, that these manuscripts also have a Caesarean quality to them. The other manuscripts that follow behind Codex Regius are very much in the tradition of Regius. And so you've got several manuscripts that are clustered together that are probably part of the same family. Although I'd hesitate in most cases saying that we have a Caesarean text. But in the case of Mark, we come as close to having a Caesarean version of the text. And I would argue that the Caesarean version eventually includes the longer ending.
What's an indication or some representative data points or style issues that you would find in the Caesarean text or family of text?
Yeah, I don't really delve into that outside of the statistical analysis, in that it's actually doing the compiling for me.
Mm-hmm.
I do in my comments particularly in my work on Acts, I do some textual commentary trying to explain that. I haven't done that much work with Mark yet to actually be able to say, okay, what are the characteristics that really makes this stand out? So the two ladies that I'd like to mention, Sylvie Raquel and Fiona Thompson, are two people who did the statistical analysis almost simultaneously with each other. That it's their data that I actually use, so I didn't redo the data. Although I have run my own data in the background to make sure that we're in the same ballpark. So, yeah. So it's not so much the character of the text that I've looked at; it's the statistical analysis, and so I've really focused on what does this tell me about the textual transmission of the text. So you probably just gave me a new task.
Yeah, it sounds like you have the next dissertation out in front of you.
Yeah. One's enough.
Well, Stan, one of the things that you're mentioning Codex Regius brings to mind is that the church didn't try to make all these things uniform, that at times they would maintain the pluriform. And it's okay to have that. So I know it's an argument from silence, and I don't want to make you speak for Origen, but when there's that kind of plurality, why would somebody like Origen, who's such a nitpicky person about the text, ignore it? Or is it just maybe we don't have that work?
Well, I think there's several things to put out in front of us. One is that Origen finds the New Testament manuscripts in his day messy.
Hmm.
And so he doesn't do the same kind of work as he did with the hexapla. I think the other challenge for Origen is that in his work in the hexapla, if something was contained in the Septuagint but not in the Hebrew, he would mark it. And he was very careful not to throw something out. He just wanted to mark that this does not occur in the Hebrew. And so he's careful about marking those kind of things. That's why I think when he runs into this kind of problem, he would simply mark it and move on. Origen, in his, particularly his New Testament textual commentary, Amy Donaldson did a great dissertation, huge 2-volume dissertation years ago, and we all still refer to it. But she basically looked at the places where the church fathers are actually discussing textual variants. So she offers a catalog of the various fathers and their own comments on it. And so you can actually get a few snippets of Origen's actual working with the text. And when he had, say, 3 variants, he would sometimes discuss the implications of all 3 and never make a choice about which one he favored. So he would basically preach from all of them. You know, in the case of the Caesarean demoniac, he actually chooses the location named. There's a little bit of variation on the exact location. He actually chooses the variant that fits the location he knows to have the right landscape. And so he doesn't always follow what we would call modern text critical rules. In fact, he's not a modern text critic, but he does. And this is what we have to appreciate about Origen. He does know the value of getting an accurate text before you do interpretation. That is simply part of the Hellenistic training of his day. So he knows there's a need to at least restore. In fact, in a citation where he talks about repairing the text, and he uses medicinal words like healing the text.
Interesting.
So Stan, I think your view is that the longer ending was added after the fact, and maybe a good starting point there would be, obviously 1680, it's very abrupt. It ends. The women are afraid. The disciples are gone. Everyone's gone. And you wonder what's next. So one can understand why a scribe would be compelled or feel compelled to actually add something that largely aligns with a combination of what you have in the other Gospels, give or take a few things.
Well, Patrick,
but what gave rise to all that?
Well, I would argue, first of all, that the ending is how should a gospel ends doesn't become a problem until the other gospels show up with endings.
Yeah.
So it may not be the problem we think as modern readers. The goal of textual criticism is to get us to the earliest form of the text. I'm not satisfied that 16:8 is necessarily the earliest form of the original text. I think it's the earliest form that we can get back to. Mm-hmm. So we can argue that the original was, torn off, and which is entirely possible.
Yeah.
But I think the general consensus in the text critical world is 16:8, the abrupt ending, as we sometimes call it, is the earliest recoverable form of this text. And I think the longer ending, for various reasons, and folks have argued various things, but the argument that makes the most sense to me is that you've got a disruption as you go into verse 9, a reintroduction to Mary Magdalene. You have basically a new start. And the stories that are contained there, they look like synopses of the other Gospels.
Other Gospels, yeah.
Yeah. So it actually looks like it's normally we think if Mark is first and Matthew second, Matthew is using Mark. This feels like it's the reverse. And And there's some awareness of John and Matthew and Luke. Particularly the Emmaus story is shrunk down to about 2 verses, and it basically says Jesus showed up in another form.
Yeah.
And that's all you get. You don't get a story as you do in Luke.
What's the derivation of the snake handling and so forth? Greg and I had a private conversation, I don't know, a few weeks ago as we were prepping for your podcast, and he speculated. I wonder if this, because we were doing the ending of Acts at the same time with Tom Phillips. I wonder if this came from Acts 28. Is that a possibility? What's your view on this weird snake handling stuff?
Paul's shipwrecked, and out comes this snake and bites him, and he just kind of shakes it off. And
yeah, I've had the thought, guys. I don't know, because it's you don't even get the same wording for snake in either of the texts.
Yeah.
So it's not as if one's a direct echo of the
parallel. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it is a type of event that you don't find in any other gospel. It's just such a rarity.
Yeah.
Well, I think the very precise language, formulaic language of baptism, it's the most pronounced way of saying what I know that the later church is teaching, but it's not quite in the language of the earlier one. For example, even in Luke, being baptized is really how one repents. This here is very precise, very precise formulaic, and so even that's stronger than you get anywhere else. And I think the reason that Origen wouldn't have a problem with it is it's probably consistent with the tradition he's received.
Yeah.
And there's nothing in that as some of, I did that earlier study on Churches of Christ, and J.W. McGarvey was a scholar within Christian Churches of Christ in the late 1800s. And he always made the case that even if you had to give up the longer ending, you pretty much had the content other places. So folks have argued for a long time that even if you gave up this ending, you'd still have this content somewhere else.
It's corroborated elsewhere.
Yeah, in the New Testament.
Very, very true. Now, Stan, if you're preaching and teaching, so you have I'm sure a number of times, Mark and the ending of Mark, where it ends in 16:8, having the disciples flee, that's not necessarily contradictory with the themes and the characterization that you've already seen in Mark leading up to 16.
Yeah.
You have the disciples, they're all fleeing. They struggle with belief. They can't grasp it, particularly once you get to chapter 8 and following. They're stumbling around. They just can't figure it all out. So when you get to 16:8 and they're gone, it's not a real big surprise. The women seem to be doing better, although they also have their struggles. And then for them to just be afraid, which is an emotional outburst, which that's a whole different podcast we're going to cover on emotion in the future, which could be viewed negatively by the actual reader in the 1st or 2nd century. That's not necessarily a contradiction in terms when it comes to the rest of the gospel. Can you talk a bit about that and how you dealt with it when you preach it from the pulpit or you're teaching it in class?
Yeah, I preach it pretty much in the same way I do the end of Acts, that we have an open ending that we continue the story. And I realize the challenge there that we're dealing with modern conceptions of open endings and those kind of things, that whether narrative or rhetorical. But I do not find the abrupt ending to be inconsistent with Markan style. Mark leaves several stories in cliffhanging kind of position.
Yeah.
One of the arguments that folks have looked at is it seems strange to end the book with the word gar, which is for. It's a postpositive. Can a sentence end in gar? Well, of course it can. These words occur, for they were afraid is literally in the Greek, they were afraid for, because of the way the Greek structure is. There is a earlier sentence in the Gospel of Mark that actually ends in gar. And so it can happen. And so if it can end a sentence, it can end a chapter, it can end a book that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's no denying that this is a very abrupt ending. But given the fact that Mark Mark's Jesus is terribly disturbing in some ways, if you read carefully. Not an unmarked way to end.
Yeah.
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 So it sounds like you would feel comfortable preaching any of the three. What about doing that for all three at once? How do you? I'm not sure if that's a good sermon, but certainly in a classroom setting, how do you help people work through the fact that maybe these things just had multiple endings?
Well, let me give what I think is the simplest answer to the text critical issues is that Mark in the earliest form, circulating in the first, second century, ends in 1608. Very early on, someone decides that there needs to be a conclusion, and so verses 9 through 20 are created. In another sphere, maybe a little closer to Rome, since we've got some old Latin manuscripts, maybe, we've got the shorter ending. But the fact that you have two endings, not to mention an expanded longer ending in one manuscript, tells you that it is in flux. The ending of Mark is in flux until we get to, I would say, at least the middle of the third century, where we begin to get manuscripts that begin to outnumber those that have the abrupt ending. And so the easy explanation is that the first round of translation, and this is where the translations, the early translation, the Armenian, the Georgian, the Syriac, the first round, all of them seem to be missing everything after verse 8. So I think what you have is you have two rounds of publications. And so the first round goes without the ending, and the next round, the translators pick up the longer ending that has since been added. And by the way, as simple as that sounds, it explains all the endings. It explains how they rose. It explains why they arose. If your text originally had 9 through 20, verses 9 through 20 on it, it's hard to explain how it lost it.
Yeah.
And so there's a pretty natural, easy explanation. And I would say that the text that eventually becomes the Caesarean text, as I've talked about, which then eventually becomes our Byzantine text, just naturally assumes it goes with it without any indication. And so again, in Eusebius's day, he could say that the accurate manuscripts end at 1608. And in our day, we can say that the majority of the manuscripts end in 1609 through 20. And every now and then you'll hear the false argument that most manuscripts have it. And the problem with that is that manuscripts are related to each other genealogically. And so once you find
older,
once you find a manuscript, well, it's a bit like we mentioned earlier with Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. If they're kin to each other, they really just get one vote. Right? And so if the Byzantine manuscripts are related to each other, they tend to get one vote.
Yeah. That's true. That's the argument. So
yeah, in the text critical world.
So if you're working in a church where people are more accustomed to, no, it has to be one, you can't have multiple like that. How do you help them work through that the early church may not have been quite as tied up in knots over the variations, even assuming if the shorter ending is more original? How do you pastorally help a group work through what the early church was doing?
Okay. Well, I think maybe finding some analogies to go with it. The early church found that the Septuagint was their translation, but they clearly knew that Hebrew Jeremiah and Septuagint Jeremiah looked very different than each other. I think the challenge here is to help people begin to think theologically about what they think about their text. Many of us started off with probably a dictation model in our head, that somehow the Bible was dictated directly from heaven straight onto the paper. That actually creates more problems than not because for a couple of reasons. One is that we know that in the production of manuscripts, there would have originally have been two copies. Always two copies. one that you kept and one that you sent.
Yeah.
So from the very beginning, our first variations can actually occur in that first move. And as we know, the majority of our variants occur very early on. They occur early. And so I think I'd want to have, Greg, a different conversation around you can't make a definition of inspiration and then expect God to obey your definition. That's actually backwards.
Right.
And so I would rather argue that um, the text has been handed to us, and there are some wrinkles in there. And the vast majority of the text, I think it's fairly solid from a text critical point of view. So when we talk about these kind of things, we're really only talking about a few. I mean, we're talking the adulterous woman, this text, and then maybe
Trinitarian formula, maybe Luke 22. There's
there's a couple of places, but
Places.
overall,
Yeah.
overall, the if the classics had as much textual evidence for the works it is embarrassing how much data we have, and that is the problem, and that is why the new genealogical method is going to going to give us some new insights, because the challenge has been holding all of this data in your head to make sense of it. And so now that we've got computers that can help us analyze it, well, you're going to see us leaving text types behind for the most part and talk in terms of, we still talk in terms of clusters. And I don't think just because I use text types both in my work in Acts and the ladies did in their work in Mark, that it's still valid, because we're doing statistical studies against actual manuscript readings.
Yeah.
So it's still true that Mark in the long run looks most like Origen's Mark looks most like Codex Regius. Yeah.
There's
So,
been a plethora, as we know, of works written on the ending of Mark.
yes.
It doesn't seem to slow down. Where do you see? I mean, you've been in your hip waders, up to your hips at least, on the ending of Mark for 30, 35 years or so, Stan. Where do you see it going, say, over the next decade? Do you see any advances here? Or do you think we're going to be talking about the same issues over and over again?
No, there's always room for discovery. We may discover a work of Origen that clearly has more of Mark's text. So I think we're going to sharpen our work. The Mark 16 conference that was referenced earlier, Claire and colleagues, I think they've actually kind of kicked up the dirt as I mean, it's the most recent research, and but to a large degree, it hasn't changed. I think my work in this article, which I don't think has received enough attention, does actually kick the ball down the court a little bit by saying, we know that Origen, because of his skill, and we know that Origen because of the type of manuscripts, and we know that Origen, because it was available to him, probably knew all these endings.
Mm-hmm. That's an advancement. You think we'll see that with some of the other church fathers or trade-ins that exist? And is there a chance, with Oxyrhynchus and, you constantly going through all the rubbish piles, we might find some papyri finally that have the ending of Mark? Who knows?
We might.
We would call you a prophet if you actually knew.
Yeah. No, we might. It would be nice to find a papyri manuscript that actually showed us a clear ending. That would get us, evidence that was a little earlier. So, I think what gets confusing in this, and Greg's mentioned kind of the pastoral side of things, is that people conflate issues. My issue is I'm a text critic. I am working at reconstructing the text. I'm going to do it on the basis of the way that we would do any other text, whether divine or otherwise, whatever we think of it. And the discussions want to throw in inspiration of the text or canonization of the text. text critics at one level, my friends may disagree, and you can have those folks come on later. I don't care about that stuff as a text critic. My job as a text critic is to do the best work I can with the evidence I have, even if I don't like the conclusions.
Understand the history of
Sure.
the transmission process and what was
That's right.
Yeah.
the most likely, most authentic or earliest version what we have our hands on. Yeah.
And I think the person who comes along and offers an explanation that makes sense of the most of the data is the one that we should go with. And I've argued a particular history of transmission. Offer me a better one. If you offer me something that you can't support with examples from history, for example, one recent author says, well, Mark intended for this to end up in his manuscript, but he died or something happened, and his followers. There's no basis in reality for even that assumption.
Yeah.
We can create those kind of scenarios. So what do I actually know? I actually know that we've got manuscripts that end at 16:8. We've got those that end with the longer ending, and those with the shorter ending, and some of those with both endings. So what explanation makes the most sense of how those arose? And that's what you run with. Yeah.
So you've alluded to this, but can you state a little bit more pointedly, what's lost for those who don't read the longer ending? So if more evidence comes to light that really solidifies 16:8 as being the original, and that people just begin to, in droves, just get rid of the longer ending, they say, well, let's not have it anywhere. What's lost when we do that?
Snake handling.
I'm okay with that part.
Honestly, I don't think the editor of that longer ending is necessarily off from Mark's intent, because he does capture that notion of unbelief that stays with the apostles all the way through the Gospel of Mark. So it's not as if it's totally off base. It appears to me that whoever composed the longer ending is also working with traditions that have been handed down. Starting off with the reintroduction of Mary in verse 9 feels like you're working from another text. It just feels like it comes from another text somewhere.
When I read that longer ending, I'm always reminded of Matthew. Greg probably is, because he's in Matthew all the time. But I'm reminded of sort of the Great Commission in a minimized sense, if you may, in Mark. When you read the short ending, you don't have that. It's, okay, now what? Which I think is a really interesting response from a reader response standpoint, which preaches well and teaches well, in my opinion, is that puts the onus on the reader, on the listener, on the congregants to actually decide. The disciples, they fell off the map. The women fell off the map. Everyone else did. Okay, now what? Now you may have some folks like the naked guy and everything else in there, is depending on how you want to read that. But that's a whole different podcast thing. The onus is put on the actual reader as to now the faith, the belief, the action is now on the actual reader. What are you going to do?
Yeah. Hey, Patrick, just to plant a bug here, that naked guy, the counterpart to him is the single angel in white garment at the end of the book. I mean, you've got an interesting inclusio there.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. So
Stan, we're about out of time here, but before we conclude, let's talk about some of the cool things. You moved up north of the border, up into Canada.
Yes.
About 12 years. How long? It's been 12 years or somewhere in that vicinity. Tell us a bit about, because our readers won't be familiar with what Alberta Bible College is and what do you guys do.
Well, let me tell a little short story about how I got here. I finished my PhD in 2014 and moved up here after a couple of great interviews with some other schools, because we had previous experience in Canada. And so I got a job. I'm not sure I was shooting to be president necessarily. I was really wanting to teach, but it's good to have a job. And listen, I love the folks that I work among, and they've treated me extremely well. Um, but because I had a job, have not worked at publishing my dissertation. And Market Vincent from Belgium, sorry, I always Peters, reached out and said, "Hey, Stan, I'm going to quote some of your dissertation," which he didn't really need to do. And then he said, "Who's publishing your work?" And I said, "Nobody." And they said, or Marcus said, "We'd be happy to."
Hmm.
So that's how publication of that came around.
That's great.
And COVID made it possible for me to do all the edits that I needed to take care of in the midst of a heavy administrative job. So now Alberta Bible College has been around since 1932.
Hmm.
Originally created by what would then have been known as the Disciples of Christ, um, to basically create pastors and church leaders for the growing churches on the prairies.
Hmm.
And so in 1937, we moved to Calgary, Alberta, which is now a city of 1.6 million people. And we've been doing this steady work. And so we are a 4-year undergraduate Bible college that produces students who some are theology majors and they go on to get their master's degree. We've had several of those. They become pastors. They become nonprofit leaders. And I have a strong and successful track of creating Christian counselors. And so those are our areas that we do. And we deliver in two basic modes. We have kind of the traditional college semesters, which we're about to begin, just like everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have what I've playfully called night school for ministers or for ministry people. And so we've done adult learning, which originally was a degree completion program, but now one can do a full degree in that same mode, and it's modular classes that occur on generally Tuesday night for 6 weeks in a row, and then we move to the next course. And so we've been steadily over the years producing ministers for a variety of churches. Historically, we're rooted with Christian churches and churches of Christ, but our students, I would say 90% of our students come from other churches. A few years, 3 years ago, we served our total student count was 100, and 25% of those were international students.
Interesting.
And we've recently had a dip in enrollment that's related to changes in how international students are being treated by the Canadian government, very similar to challenges that you'll find in the United States. So,
you have online programs as well, Stan, or is it all in person?
well, it's all synchronous classes with Zoom based, but we are looking at doing some things asynchronous. But for a Bible college, we've had an excellent turnout of students that have gone on to do their master's work and even their doctorate work. So we are doing something that one wouldn't always think of a Bible college as being an incubator for some
scholarship.
Great, yeah. We offer both Hebrew and Greek here in alternate years, and so when I first arrived, we did Greek. We've added Hebrew, and I added 10 years ago now, added a program in nonprofit management, which because a lot of our students didn't want to or weren't going into ministry the way they want, but they wanted to do something to change the world. And to do nonprofit work in Canada requires an extra set of knowledge related to the way the Canadian government wants to set you up. Yeah. And so we particularly train people in a very specific way how to do work in Alberta, but particularly Canada.
Interesting.
Stan, do your students have the opportunity to study at some of the other universities there in Calgary? Do you have any agreements so that they can study in both places?
I do not have an agreement with Ambrose University yet, but good conversations coming up. Okay. Cochrane has a not a real, we don't have a strong transfer agreement, but we're in a consortium together. We share resources. And so we work with that. There are schools that are interested in partnering with us, like Ozark Bible College, part of the Christian church tradition. Abilene and I are having some conversations about what the connection ought to be. So there's some very, very vibrant conversations going on there. So I continue.
That takes a lot of administrative work. Do you have time, other than now that you've got your dissertation edited? Do you have time for writing other things? You've done the Ananias and Sapphira piece.
It does cut into my writing. I do have a couple of articles that I want to spin off of the dissertation, some mini articles, and so I do have some more writing to do. But no, it's hard to squeeze it in because I'm also serving as one of the chairs for the New Testament division. By the way, it's really no longer SBL because SBL stopped doing the regional stuff, but our region loved what we were doing so much that we just kept doing it, and we do it under the umbrella of AAR now.
Mm-hmm.
So, but our regional meetings still happen every year, and so we're currently editing a book on power and authority in the New Testament.
Oh, that's interesting. That'll be. We'll need to have you back to talk about that.
Love to.
Podcast. So Stan, for folks who want to get in touch with you, the Alberta Bible College website we'll have at the bottom of the podcast. But just for those who are listening, what's the URL?
It's abccampus.ca.
That's easy to remember. And for folks that want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch with you about your research if they want to have you come out?
Just reach out to me. It's the easiest way is president@abccampus.ca. It'll come to me.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Stan, it is great reconnecting with you.
Good to see you.
Spend those days with Dr. Osborne. I know you were, and I was very, very fortunate to meet some great people like yourself, along with some others along the way. So thanks for reconnecting with us.
All right, Greg, good to meet you as well.
Great to meet you, Stan.
Check out other Scriptural Works podcasts at scripturalworks.com, or check us out on YouTube or your favorite podcast channels such as Apple or Spotify. For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.